In the winter of 1135, a king lay dying in Normandy, supposedly undone by a meal of lampreys. As King Henry I took his final breath, the clock began to tick on the most fragile peace England had ever known. For years, the king had forced his barons to swear they would accept his daughter, the Empress Matilda, as their rightful queen. It was a plan designed to defy centuries of tradition. But as the royal bells began to toll across the channel, a different figure was already stepping into the shadows of a waiting ship. Welcome back to Lemmy History. This is episode 2 of our 4-part series on the rise of the House of Plantagenet and the era of chaos known as the Anarchy. If you are joining us for the first time, you've arrived at the turning point. In our last episode, we saw how a single shipwreck, the sinking of the White Ship, wiped out the only male heir to the English throne and forced King Henry I into a desperate corner. He named his daughter, the Empress Matilda, as his successor. But in the medieval world, a king's word was only as strong as the sword that enforced it. As usual, you can understand every episode without having seen the others. But now, back to it. While Matilda remained in Anjou, caught in a web of pregnancy and political distance, her cousin, Stephen of Blois, was making a move that would change the course of history forever. This was not just a family squabble, it was the Great Betrayal. It was the moment a sacred oath, sworn on the holiest relics in Christendom, was tossed aside for the lure of a golden circle. Today, we look at the man who stole a kingdom, the woman who refused to let it go, and the cold, calculated steps that led a nation to the brink of total collapse. This is the prelude to the storm. This is the moment the crown of England became a prize for the fastest thief. On December 1st, 1135, that sword fell from Henry's hand. The Lion of Justice was dead at the age of 67. In the 12th century, the death of a king was the most dangerous moment in the life of his realm. There was no automatic succession as we would suspect it, and would develop later on. The moment the king died, the king's peace died with him. Suddenly, there were no laws. Courts stopped functioning. Outlaws felt emboldened. The barons, who had been kept under Henry's iron thumb for 35 years, suddenly felt the weight lift. And boy, did they like that feeling. The primary problem was location. Henry died at Saint-Denis-le-Fermont in Normandy. Matilda, his chosen heir, was south in Anjou. She was the daughter of the king, yes, but she was also a woman in a world that equated leadership with physical, martial presence. More importantly, she was currently embroiled in a dispute with her father over her dowry and was reportedly pregnant with her third son. She was not at her father's bedside. She was not in control of the royal treasury. She was, for all intents and purposes, out of the loop. This silence from the empress created a vacuum. In the medieval mind, a kingdom could not breathe without a king. The barons needed a leader, but more than that, they needed someone who was there. And while Matilda waited in the south, a man across the sea was already looking toward the English coast. His name was Stephen of Blois, and he was about to prove that in the Game of Thrones, being first is often more important than being right. Stephen of Blois was not a distant stranger or a dark villain from a foreign land. He was Henry's favorite nephew. He was the son of Adela, the daughter of William the Conqueror. This made him a grandson of the man who had won England in 1066. Stephen had been raised at Henry's court. He had been given vast estates in both England and Normandy. He was the Count of Boulogne, one of the wealthiest men in Europe. In many ways, Stephen was the anti-Matilda. Where Matilda was often described as haughty, distant, and imperial, largely due to her years as the Holy Roman Empress, Stephen was the ultimate people's prince. Chroniclers of the time, even those who eventually supported Matilda, described Stephen as a man of incredible personal charm. He was handsome, brave in battle, and famously approachable. He was the kind of lord who would sit and eat with his knights, who would listen to the grievances of the common people, and who lacked the terrifying, cold-blooded edge that had made his uncle, Henry, so feared. But this niceness was a double-edged sword. Stephen was well-liked, but he was also perceived as malleable. To the powerful barons of England, the idea of a kind king was far more attractive than a strong queen. They believed that under Stephen, they would have more autonomy, more land, and more power. Stephen wasn't just a candidate for the throne, he was a candidate for a weaker monarchy. The lords liked their newfound freedom and wished to keep it. It is one of the great ironies of history that Stephen had been the first layman to swear the oath of fealty to Matilda in 1127. He had stood before his uncle, placed his hand on the Bible, and promised to support her claim. At the time, he was the king's most loyal servant. But as he stood on the shores of Boulogne in December 1135, the memory of that oath seems to have faded in the face of a divine opportunity. He saw a vacant throne, a hesitant nobility, and a cousin who was miles away. Stephen didn't see himself as a traitor. He likely saw himself as a savior who would prevent a civil war by taking the crown before someone else did. You might ask, how does a medieval man, in an age where the soul's salvation depended on keeping one's word, simply ignore a sacred oath? The answer lies in the legalistic and religious gymnastics of the 12th century. Stephen and his supporters didn't just say, "I'm breaking my word." They found a way to argue that the oath was never valid in the first place. The first argument was coercion. Stephen's supporters, led by his brother Henry of Blois, who conveniently happened to be the powerful Bishop of Winchester, argued that King Henry I had forced the barons to swear the oath against their will. In medieval canon law, an oath made under duress was not binding in the eyes of God. The second argument was even more personal. They claimed that on his deathbed, King Henry had changed his mind. They produced a witness, a man named Hugh Bigod, who was the king's steward. Bigod swore an oath of his own that in his final moments the king had become disillusioned with Matilda, largely due to her husband Geoffrey of Anjou, and had released the barons from their promise, implicitly clearing the way for Stephen. Whether this was true or a blatant lie is one of history's great mysteries, but it gave the church the out it needed to support Stephen. If this sounds familiar, yes, that was the inspiration for House of the Dragon. Finally, there was the issue of the Angevin marriage I already touched upon in the first episode. Matilda was married to Geoffrey Plantagenet, the Count of Anjou. The Normans and Angevins were ancestral enemies. The thought of an Angevin husband ruling through an English queen was enough to make any Norman baron's blood boil. By breaking their oath to Matilda, the barons weren't just choosing Stephen, they were rejecting Anjou. They convinced themselves that they were protecting the purity of the Norman conquest. With these justifications in place, Stephen's conscience, and the consciences of the English lords, was conveniently cleared for the coup. The moment the news of the king's death reached Stephen in Boulogne, he didn't hesitate. He didn't wait for a council of barons. He didn't send a letter to Matilda. He boarded a ship with a small band of retainers and sailed for England. His journey was not without omens. When he tried to land at Dover, the gates were slammed in his face. When he went to Canterbury, he was refused entry. The local officials were terrified of breaking the king's peace. But Stephen knew where the real power lay: London. London in 1135 was already becoming the heartbeat of the kingdom. The citizens of London had a unique privilege, the right to elect a leader in times of crisis. When Stephen arrived at the city gates, he didn't come as a conqueror, he came as a friend. He promised the Londoners that he would grant them new liberties and protect their trade. The city, desperate for a stable leader to prevent rioting and chaos, hailed him as king. But a king without gold is just a man with a title. Stephen's next stop was Winchester. Winchester was the site of the royal treasury. It was the vault that held the accumulated wealth of King Henry's 35-year reign, the taxes, the silver, and the crown jewels. More importantly, Winchester was controlled by Stephen's brother, Bishop Henry of Blois. This is where the Great Betrayal was finalized. Bishop Henry used his immense influence to convince the royal treasurer to hand over the keys. With the treasury in his hands, Stephen could now pay for the support of the church and buy the loyalty of the mercenary captains he would need to defend his claim. Within 3 weeks of King Henry's death, Stephen of Blois had secured the capital, the money, and the blessing of the most powerful bishop in the land. On December 22nd, 1135, Stephen was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. The betrayal was complete. The crown was on his head, and the oath to Matilda was a dead letter. While Stephen was being anointed with holy oil in London, what was happening in Anjou? Matilda's reaction to the news of her father's death and Stephen's coronation was a mix of profound grief and incandescent rage. To Matilda, this wasn't just a political setback. It was an insult to her bloodline and her status as an empress. Matilda had been raised to believe in the absolute authority of the crown. She had spent her formative years as the wife of the Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful man in Europe. She did not understand the chummy politics that Stephen used to win over the Londoners. To her, leadership was a divine right, not a popularity contest. When she learned that Stephen, the cousin she had known her whole life, the man who had been the first to swear fealty to her, had stolen her throne, it solidified her resolve. However, Matilda was in a difficult position. She was in the late stages of pregnancy, which limited her ability to lead an immediate military expedition. Furthermore, her husband, Geoffrey of Anjou, was more interested in seizing lands in Normandy than in crossing the Channel to win England for his wife. This created a tension that would plague Matilda's cause for years. She was fighting for her own right to rule, while her husband was fighting for his own territorial gains. But Matilda was not idle. She began a brilliant legal and diplomatic counteroffensive. She sent envoys to the Pope in Rome, arguing that Stephen was a perjurer, a man who had broken a sacred oath. She began reaching out to her half-brother, Robert of Gloucester, the most powerful, illegitimate son of King Henry. Robert was a brilliant general and a man of great integrity who was now torn between his oath to his sister and the reality of Stephen's coronation. Matilda's strategy was simple. She would wait. She would let the initial excitement of Stephen's reign wear off. She knew that Stephen's kindness would eventually be seen as weakness, and that the barons would soon grow tired of his inability to keep order. She was the Lady of the English, and she was prepared to wait years, if necessary, to reclaim what was hers. In the first few months of his reign, Stephen appeared to be a success. He held a magnificent Easter court in 1136, where almost all the great barons of England, including Matilda's brother Robert, came to do him homage. He issued a Charter of Liberties, promising to undo the harsh taxes and forest laws of his uncle Henry. He seemed to be the good king everyone wanted, but the cracks were already starting to show. Because Stephen had seized the throne through a coup, he felt he owed everyone. He began handing out titles, lands, and money to ensure loyalty. But the more he gave, the more the barons demanded. He created earldoms for his friends, which annoyed the established nobility. He allowed barons to build adulterine castles, fortresses built without royal permission. Stephen was trying to buy peace, but he was actually buying chaos. In his desire to be liked, he he refused to punish those who broke the law. When the King of Scotland, David I, invaded the north under the pretext of defending Matilda's rights, Stephen didn't crush him. He bought him off with land and titles. To the warlike Norman barons, this didn't look like kindness. It looked like a vacuum of power. The great irony of the Great Betrayal is that by taking the crown to save the kingdom from a woman's rule, Stephen actually unleashed the very forces of disorder that King Henry had spent 30 years suppressed. The barons began to realize that if Stephen wouldn't enforce the law, they would have to enforce their own, or follow it. Private wars began to break out. Old land disputes were settled with the sword. The Lion of Justice was dead, and in his place was a king of straw. We cannot talk about this period without discussing the Church. In the 12th century, the Church was the ultimate arbiter of legitimacy. If the Pope said you were king, you were king. Stephen's brother, Henry of Blois, was the mastermind behind winning over the clergy. He was not just a bishop, he was a man who dreamed of becoming the Archbishop of Canterbury and eventually a papal legate. Henry of Blois convinced the English bishops that Stephen would be a servant of the Church, whereas Matilda, with her imperial background, would likely try to dominate it. The Church's support was the final nail in the coffin of Matilda's immediate hopes. With the Pope's official recognition of Stephen in 1136, Matilda was technically a rebel in the eyes of the law. Matilda had made enemies in Rome during her time as Empress and Regent of Italy. This decade-old mistake now returned to haunt her. However, Stephen's ecclesial support was fragile. Henry of Blois was a man of immense ego. He supported Stephen because he thought he could control him. The moment Stephen began to act independently, or worse, the moment Stephen failed to grant Henry the power he craved, the Church's support would begin to waver. The Great Betrayal was built on a foundation of shifting sands, held together by a king who couldn't say no, and a bishop who wanted to be the power behind the throne. By the end of 1137, the honeymoon period of Stephen's reign was over. The treasury that Henry I had spent a lifetime filling was nearly empty, drained by Stephen's attempts to buy loyalty. The King of Scotland was hovering in the north. The Welsh were in open rebellion, and in the south, across the Channel, the Empress Matilda was finally ready. Her son, the future Henry II, was growing older. Her half-brother, Robert of Gloucester, was becoming increasingly disillusioned with Stephen's erratic leadership. The barons who had cheered for Stephen in London were now grumbling in their castles. They had realized that a nice king was a dangerous king. The Great Betrayal had worked in the short term. Stephen had the crown, the capital, and the blessing of Rome. But he didn't have the one thing that made a medieval kingdom function: the respect of his rivals. He had proven that oaths could be broken, which meant that no one's word was now worth anything. He had set a precedent for treason that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Matilda was no longer just a distant memory or a rejected daughter. She was becoming a symbol of the old order, the daughter of the Lion who promised to bring back the stability that Stephen had traded away for popularity. The stage was set. The legal arguments were finished. The diplomatic maneuvers were exhausted. The story of the Great Betrayal is a reminder that history is rarely decided on the battlefield alone. It is decided in the hearts of men who decide to break their word, in the speed of a ship crossing the Channel, and in the desperate need for a leader in a time of crisis. Stephen of Blois was not a monster, but his ambition led him to pull a thread that unraveled the entire fabric of English society. He thought he was taking a shortcut to peace. Instead, he had paved the road to a 19-year nightmare. The Great Betrayal was the prologue to a tragedy that would see towns burned, fields left fallow, and the people of England cry out that God and his saints slept. Thank you for joining us for this second chapter of the rise of the House of Plantagenet. If you want to see the moment this political tension turns into a bloody, visceral reality, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Lemmy History. In the next episode, the war finally begins. Matilda lands on the shores of England, Robert of Gloucester throws down the gauntlet, and the nation is torn in two. We will witness the Battle of Lincoln, the capture of a king, and the moment the Empress finally comes face to face with the throne she was promised. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, hype, and subscribe.